morning. My name is Sylvain Carle. I'm a developer advocate for Twitter. I just started Twitter about 4 months ago. So this is my first official presentation as Twitter. So be kind with me. Of course, you'll tweet about it. I'm a web nerd. I'm a community builder. I originally come from Montreal, so I'm Canadian. You can use that hashtag, or Québécois, if you know how to write that one. I used to pitch my own startups all the time. I must say, I'm really proud of what we've been building and shipping at Twitter, despite whatever you can read in TechCrunch. So what I want to do today is give you a quick tour of a few of the different parts of our platform you can develop with, and then do a deep dive on the latest one that's called Embedded Timelines. So I'm really happy also to contribute to this focus at Twitter on the web layer. Previously, most of the developer tools we were working on were backend tools, so you had to call the API, the REST API, the streaming API. So we're shipping a bunch of new stuff, specifically for the web layer. So this is titled The Fox and the Stork. So anyone has ever read that fable before? Okay, I can tell it to you, it's not that long. There's a whole team at Twitter working on code that we ship elsewhere. So there's a bunch of us working on Twitter.com, but there's also a lot of code that we're shipping elsewhere, so that's what I'm going to focus on this morning. So originally this fable is from Aesop, but also has been rewritten a few times. If you didn't read it, there's this fox and then there's this stork, and they decide to play a trick on each other. It's really quick to read. You can read it. It's in Old French though. If you can't read it, this is how Java looks to me. Anyhow, the short story is you have this fox that invites the stork and decides just to play a trick to serve it in a flat plate. So obviously the stork, with its long beak, can't have it. And the stork, not to be the only one that's being pulled a trick on, invites the fox and serves the dinner in this really long vase. And obviously the fox can't eat the dinner. So the fox unfriended the stork on Facebook, but still followed her on Twitter just to make sure she wouldn't complain too much about the lunch, because you know that's why Twitter was invented, to complain and to talk about your lunch. So, more seriously. Today, focus on the web stack, so HTML, JavaScript, CSS, with a little help from Ben Ward. He's one of the lead front-end engineer at Twitter. Actually, he did a pretty good presentation this summer at Open Webcam. It's linked here, so PragTurf.js, it's a bit.ly link. Today I'm going to give you an overview, and if you want to deep dive, everything I'm presenting has a link on it, and you can read it online. So I sat down with Ben to get some perspective and just get an idea of like what were the goals in implementing this new embeddable code, challenges, some implementation details, and some insights that we gathered in the process. So I was really happy that Ben actually put a picture of a stork on top of his presentation. Then I looked more closely and I was like, oh no, it's going on the other way, so that's not the beak, that's the tail, so never mind. One of the lessons that Ben outlined in that presentation, I'm going to start from that and build on, is that shared code is for mutual benefit. So there's a real challenge in building code that's going to be shared on other sites. So you have to give and take. So we take responsibility for the technical cost. If we're shipping something that's going to be implemented on millions of websites, we take the full responsibility for that code. But then again, there's some control that you want to build in your stack so that you make sure that it doesn't go crazy on everyone else's website. The HTML layer is also served in many places in Twitter. So, of course, you know of twitter.com. So that's what we call the desktop experience. That's what most everyone sitting at their desk all day can see. There's also two versions of mobile, m.twitter.com, a version for smartphones, and a version we call M2 for feature phones. So not so smartphones, let's call them. We also serve from platform.twitter.com, so embedded timelines and widgets and embedded tweets are served from platform.twitter.com, that's syndication. And they're also served in other clients, like if you use web.tweetdeck.com, you're actually seeing HTML, CSS, and CSS from Twitter team. So, and there's web views in different clients. On the iPad app, sometimes you flip and you see HTML. And of course, everyone using Twitter through the APIs will most likely serve you HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but we don't guarantee that one. It also has many names. So we call it Twitter for Websites. So Twitter for Websites is everything you can put on your website. Can you see how the marketing department is just getting started? Twitter for Websites, button, retweets, tweet counters. If you want to embed tweets live, if you want to embed a timeline, I'll talk about that. And then we have Twitter cards, which is kind of the flip side. You put some markup on your site, and when we display it on twitter.com or in Twitter clients, we will use what you have set up. There's a Twitter API, version 1.1 shipped recently. That's the best way to get the most flexibility. And everything I'm talking today, you can find at dev.twitter.com and follow @Twitter API. What you're not seeing here is the 100 of a project code named after birds. That got confusing for the first few weeks. But we try to make it pretty descriptive here. Also, it's presented in many ways. So, three basic ways that we serve it. We do render HTML. So some of the products you can use, some of the calls you can make will render basic HTML elements. We will serve you JavaScript and CSS, and then you can prep it up, so you can extend it. So that's probably the simplest way to get started. As I mentioned with Twitter cards, we do the opposite. So you insert meta tags, and I'll show them to you. You insert meta tags, and we control the rendering because it's in Twitter's own site and clients. So you control the content, but not the rendering on this one. And you can get it as JSON, so or APIs, image JSON, only JSON now with the latest version. So you can manipulate it and do pretty much everything you want as long as you respect a few simple rules. And before I deep dive, one thing that you have to remember, and that's pretty important, when I talk about developer, about mainly the difference between Twitter and, let's say, another social website, you have to remember that tweets are born from SMS. So they're short, they're real-time. So they were born as real-time notification. Of course, they've grown up on the web. But when you think about tweets, you really have to think about short, real-time streams, flows, timelines, and not really about pages. So think about them as Twitter is a transport, and you have these little bits, these little messages that you can work with. But of course, we're good citizens of the web, so every tweet has a permalink. We all know that cool URIs don't change. But tweets are not really pages that you look for a long time. So if you're thinking about an application for Twitter or with tweets or with Twitter identity, don't think about a page where people will sit for a long time. Think about the flow. So the tweet ID is the parent, and we do attach in our structure replies, retweet, favorites, and everything. But there's a lot of data also that you can get from a tweet. I'll show you a bit of that to you when we look at API. So Twitter for websites, two simplest things you can do. You can have buttons, tweets, hashtags, follow buttons, and tweet to someone. What's really interesting about these buttons is that there's the simplest HTML thing that will work. It's just a link. Okay, so we built these with web intents. So the reason for that is, in the worst possible situation, let's say you still get your tweets by SMS. You will get the text, and we will attach a link, and you'll be able to follow that link. But the Twitter button will still work even if you're using, let's say, Netscape 2, if that's possible, or Mosaic, or links, more likely. So these embedded tweets and buttons are really just served as an HTML element. So you have the A element with the intent. So here you have the share button /share, the class that we'll use to dress up that button, and we're using the data dash element here, that lang, to set the language of the tweet. If you set it to a different value, like FR for French or D for German, we will internationalize, we will localize the context for you. Then, super simple call, one-line script that I've unpacked here just a little bit for you. So you call this function, and then for buttons and for tweets, we inject them directly in the DOM. So we're injecting these in your page. They're smaller, so there's not a lot of cost. It's just a few calls. We pack our JavaScript together, so just to make sure that it's as well cached as possible. I was pretty happy listening to the keynote this morning that Twitter was not on the screen. I thought he should have like good citizens and show a few of those, because we work really hard on caching and compacting our stuff. And then what we do is that we just inject the simple context to dress up that link with the actions that are possible to take, but that's really just a link, and the CSS that we make available. Twitter cards, like I said, are the opposite. So for now, they're not super exciting. As you can see, this is a summary tweet. You have a title, a description, an image, site attribution, the New York Times at NY Times, and if you look up there, author attribution. So if you've ever worked with open graph tags, this is exactly the same. In fact, we do support open graph tags. If open graph was really open and it was a standard, Twitter would gladly participate in setting that standard of meta tagging elements to display elsewhere. But for now, we support open graph tags, and you can insert Twitter tags in your pages for specific elements. So if you're used to writing HTML, and I sure hope you are, if you're sitting in this room, simple Twitter card, the type is a summary, the site attribution. So that's one you might want to use. So let's say you're using Open Graph, and you've marked up most of your pages, but all that information is either generic or Facebook specific. If you want to give proper attribution to get the username rendered correctly on Twitter, that's one you want to use. So the Twitter site, that would be for your main site. And Twitter creator is to give attribution. So a typical example here would be an author. So if you want to give credit to an author, you would use Twitter creator. A pretty crafty use of that is Etsy. So Etsy implemented Twitter cards and is giving attribution to their store owners. So if you have a store on Etsy and someone sends a link to Twitter, anyone can send a link to your store on Etsy, you'll get attribution. So that's pretty cool. The URL, so that's the canonical URL for your resource. The title, the description, and the image. So of all these, if you've already implemented Open Graph tags, there's just a few you need to add. Or what we're seeing also is that some publishers are using both. So they would have a different description for Open Graph. So let's say in their Open Graph description, they would say, like this publication or share with your friends. And for Twitter, they would say retweet and favorite. So you can have a description for Facebook and a description for Twitter. That's different, and that's optimized for different networks. Like I said, what's interesting about this one is that we control the rendering, but also the caching. So if your image, let's say Lady Gaga decides to retweet your tweet with this awesome image from your blog, you won't crash. Her 15 million followers will get it from Twitter's cache. What's interesting also, we're starting to see some frameworks implementing Open Graph and Twitter tags directly in the code base. So if you have a WordPress blog, there's the Yoast SEO plugins that implement Twitter tags. Super easy to, if you have the latest version, you have Twitter tags if you don't know. There's a bunch of guys that are working on a module for Drupal. So Drupal sites will be getting Twitter cards and Open Graph, and a few others in the works. Next option that you have is to use the API. So we have two APIs, two public APIs that you can use. The REST API is probably the easiest one to use if you're a web developer. Version 1.1 of the API that was announced a few months ago requires authentication. So that's a big difference. So if you are used to developing with API 1.0, no authentication were required. In 1.1, we do require OAuth authentication. There's many libraries out there to help you, but that's what you get now with OAuth is that you have improved rate limits. So when Kavit with the previous API was the rate limiting, for some methods we're like something like 150 calls per hour. We've actually quadrupled most of the calls that you can make to the Twitter API once you're authenticated. The other downside, or upside, depending if you're maintaining a library for those, is JSON support only. So we were really not seeing a lot of traction for Atom, feed, or XML. I don't have the exact number, but something like more than 75 or 80% of our calls were, if not more, were using JSON. So we decided to focus on JSON and have all the resources there. And what we did is that we updated our rules of the road and display requirements, stating that if you want to display a tweet on your site, there's just a few certain things that you have to do to make sure it's recognized as a tweet. So I won't dig into all the details here, but if you go to the API overview that's listed there, you'll get all the nitty-gritty details, and also developer forums. So ask questions. We try our best to answer. The volume is pretty high, but we try to answer everyone. That's just a super simple beginning of a reply from the REST APIs. The only thing I want to outline here is if you look at line 10, we've added something called entities. So now, for most of the objects in the Twitter API, we have them as entities, and so you can unpack the detail of that data structure. A good example of something with entities is a URL, a link that you're on Twitter. As you know, there's the original link, the original URL for that link. There's the display value, so we truncate the domain and the link to display it. And there's also what the t.co, which is the link shortener that's built in Twitter that we use. So if you get a tweet and you want to get the details for a specific link in a tweet, you'll actually get the entities collection, which will give you 3 values: the original link, the shortened link with t.co, and the display that we're using. The last API is the streaming API. So I won't dig in too much, but this is for anyone doing real-time applications. You would start a listener, and instead of polling like the REST API and getting some results, you would open a connection, open the stream, and just get the results streaming in. So there's a pretty, if you go to /docs/streaming APIs on Twitter, you will get a demo tool there where you can start a session and see how it works. It does have, it's over SSL, you have to do an OAuth handshake, and then you get the stream. That was actually, for 1 second, I had like 20 screens of these, but you get all the JSON object in the stream as they come through. So a typical usage would be listening for a search result over a hashtag, or all the tweets from someone, or all the tweets mentioning someone. These are things that you can do. Embedded timelines and tweets. So this is the new one we shipped. We saw that we had widgets before that we shipped. First version of widget, I was going to call them 1.0, maybe they were 0.1. And they were pretty flexible on the front end, but not that great on the back end. Namely, they were rate limited by our own API, so that's dog food for you. And they would site with very heavy load, meaning more than 150 calls per hour. That's my blog. That's easy. Just my mother checking my blog is more calls than that. It would not work. So we've corrected that, and we've shipped these embedded timelines. They've been out for a bit more than a month, and they work they're really similar to embedded tweets and the embedded buttons that I showed you before, with a little bit more flash on them. So we call them with their Twitter timeline. So it's a collection of tweets, and you call them on a username. So as you can see, that /Twitter API would be your username or the site's username, because widgets are bound to a username. I'll show you after why. Then there's a widget ID. There's a theme, so we ship with a light and dark theme. A link color that's configurable, and some related information. That's for a search. I'll show you after how it works. These are also, we made a best effort for the first version to be accessible. So we do have ARIA elements. So we support screen readers for those. And you can set weight, height, and language, like I mentioned previously, to set the context. So all this, as you can see, is a simple link. And same pattern, script, where we inject the widget. A big difference here compared to the button and the tweet, we protect the code in an iframe. So I'll talk a bit more about why we do that, but for a timeline, it makes things a bit simpler. Before I go there, I'll show you the. So if you go to your profile here on Twitter, you will see on the left there's a new option called Widget. And, I should pull that. You can create a new widget. You can create a new widget that's either a user timeline, a favorite, a list, or a search. So by selecting one of these 4 options, you're able to create a widget and get the simplest line of code that represents that widget. So let's say I would want to create a favorite list. And then these are the default parameters. You can overwrite them after, but you can set the default here. And you can control, in fact, you have to control where will this code be able to be rendered. So you can use star patterns here. So let's say you have a series of blogs, so it could be star.blogs.com, or your own domain. And then if you create a widget, you'll get the line of code here. That's the simplest line of code you can cut and paste in your site, like I showed you before. Essentially, something like that. And then what you can do is that everything that's created, you can overwrite. Almost everything you can overwrite. So it starts with a light or dark theme, and then you can override the link color, the width, and the height. It's important to know that these are it's progressive enhancement, so they should work everywhere. We did set a minimum width and height to start, just to make sure they wouldn't be too squeezed, but they should fill up the height and the width that you declare in your elements. Set the language. You can set the intent to users. That's why they work really well with a username. And support, as I said, ARIA for accessibility. So like I said, the previous widget that we shipped, like dog years ago, like 2.5 years ago, so that's like 19.25 years ago. It was using the API 1.0, so eventually the widget code became sentient and tweeted that it was committing suicide. So the goals for our new design was to optimize for performance. So we're a guest, so remember the golden rule. If you have a stork for lunch, give him the correct plate. So it's coded defensively, so it's implemented in an iframe sandbox. From the core element, just a link. What we do is, it's like I said, it's responsive design. So there's a solid baseline that you can extend to a certain limit. And it's also built as a series of standalone modules. So depending on the timeline you're showing to your user, you're implementing on your site, there's one JavaScript column, but there's actually a series of different snippets that we will insert. So it's pretty small. The goal was to cache as aggressively as possible. We heard that this morning. It's the first time we hear about that. So our goal was to ship this as small as possible. So our target size was 20K. Looking at jQuery, it starts at 30K, so that didn't work. So we didn't use any existing JavaScript framework for our widgets. We just implemented the smallest possible footprint JavaScript. We had to decide, should we render these to the client side or server side? So as some of you are aware, you used to see some hash bangs, so like this hash in the URL at Twitter or elsewhere. So we would dynamically reconstruct the UI from the JSON that we were sending with the HTTP request in the HTML, but that's not really accessible, if at all, and that's not really cacheable, and that's not really crawlable. So what we're doing now is that we're rendering in your DOM. So for tweets and buttons, the JavaScript is rendered in your page. So any robot, fetcher, crawler that can parse JavaScript in a page will store it accordingly. And so we render those in the page. For timelines, because they're a bit more complex, what we do is that we actually render the HTML on our server, and then we serve you that result in the iframe. So when you're putting the little widget.js on your site for a timeline, what you're really putting is the anchor so that we can expand an iframe with the HTML pre-rendered. That scales a lot better. And we can serve it much faster because it's static HTML that you're receiving. Everything there is asynchronous, of course. What you also get when I say that this content is specific and is optimized as like from bottom up instead of having something that's really complex that we dumb down, is that we can detect the context. So we do have built-in touch events. So the touch is not like a click. So we optimize the touch target for the different platforms. We also, another challenge is that we're served in 28 different languages. So I'll talk a bit more about that, but we also support 28 localizations for widgets. And the last challenge is that our goal was to be able to scale to 10 and 25 million impressions per domain per day. So just to give you an idea, when CNN puts your widget on their homepage for the presidential debate, you better be ready. So we've implemented 4 types of timeline, like I mentioned: a user, favorite, list, and search. And it's configured at the user level. So configure at the user level doesn't mean it has to be your user. It just means that it starts with a user object to construct the timeline. So let's say you're watching that presidential debate and you want to make a tweet for @BigBird. You can create a widget for @BigBird, Big Bird's favorite, Big Bird's list, whatnot. So it doesn't mean that it's constrained to your user. It just means that it starts from a user to be able to build the different views. Of course, you can also tie it to your developer account, to your user, and create a timeline that has nothing to do with your users. So let's say I'm subscribed to the HTML5 DevCon Twitter list. I could create a widget for my own site displaying the tweets from that list, even though, so I'm subscribed to that list, but I'm not part of that list, but that's how I would configure it. So even though we're built as modules, there's only one, you make one call. So what happens is this, on the server side, we do the rendering on the server, so we use Hogan. Hogan is a project from Twitter that's been open source. So it works from mustache templates, and it renders them server side. And actually, it's a renderer. So for example, I would render 28 different versions of the widget for different languages. So that way, Hogan walks through your different templates, through your permutations, and renders the static version. So you can check it out on GitHub, twitter.github.com/hogan.js. We've looked at other options that that we could use, but this one seemed like a specific use case for us, but could also be of general use. So as much of the internal tools that we develop at Twitter, this one has been open source on GitHub. If you just look at the root, twitter.github.com, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. We've open sourced recently Clutch.io, or AB framework, that you can check there in JavaScript. So that's some of the internal tools that we're using. One of the biggest benefits, so if you're thinking about implementing your own widget, let's say Twitter widget's fine, but that's not what you're looking for. Some of the things that we've learned in this process of building our own widget. Sandboxing with an iframe is really the only sane way to do anything more complex than a few lines. Basically, especially for the C part in CSS, you get to keep your cascade. If you ever try to inject your own CSS in other people's pages, you know that you have to namespace everything. You break the cascade. You're never sure if you're into someone else's boxes. What's the model? Are you in the box model? That's padded okay. Does it work for IE? So it's how, in a short way to summarize it. So injecting an iframe gives us full control. What we're doing with our JavaScript is that we have only one global that we're exposing. So we have this Twitter global, and that's it. Everything is, after that, is within the scope of our iframe. So we just use the Twitter variable to register in the DOM, and for some events that we pass through, but besides that, everything is protected. It's accessible with ARIA, and we try to strike the balance of let's ship something that by default is pretty good, and then developer can extend. Like I mentioned, there's about 7 or 10 different attributes you can play with. We're open for suggestions also if you have ideas, if you look at this and you really think you need a widget with a green, flashy background. We didn't ship that, but we can discuss about it. You can override some of these things. We did do some really conscious design decisions. So this is something that we felt strongly about, that the default views should look like tweets. So you have the avatar, you have the timestamp, you have the actions. People can reply, favorites to a tweet, retweets. And we've also shipped at the bottom of the widget, you can reply inline. If you look at this little intent, that's a second intent. You can tweet someone from that little intent. And if you want, you can unpack it. You could just take that little piece and just take that part and put that on any site to tweet to the author or to anyone you configure there. We have an event model right now with everything we're shipping for the web. I would say maybe half of our events are currently exposed to developers. We're working on opening more of those. And we want it to be lightweight. So as a regular user can go to their settings page and create their own widget, and that's fairly straightforward. But then you can extend it and make a bit more of it. So that's it for the general tour. I don't know if you guys, I don't know if there's a mic or if this room is small enough, but I can take 5-10 minutes of questions from you guys on any of the topics that we've presented today. Sure.
What are you using for cross-domain communication from the iframe out?
From the iframe out to the page, we host our own, we do our own internally at Twitter, and for IE we serve the cross-domain files from our servers.
So like post message and like flash fallbacks and stuff?
We don't do flash fallback. We keep everything in the iframe. So we don't do a lot of communication. We just expose one variable to make, if someone wants to register the fact that the widget has loaded, but the rest we don't do cross-domain in the widget. In the main window, yeah. So when we inject the JavaScript, we create the global there. And we know, since we created it, we know it's there. And it's mainly for external usage. Since we control everything in the iframe, the fact that we're also serving code that's multi-static enables us to to be pretty sure that there's not a lot of race conditions happening within the iframe and outside of the iframe. So that's why we shipped with only a few of the events exposed, because we wanted to make sure that that code was stable and running well before exposing too much stuff. Yep.
Well, it's more of a comment, maybe a vote or something. So my company, we mobilize websites, and yeah, the iframe's not happy in mobile browsers. It's like one of the first things you have to do is go and like put in a simplified something for mobile, because it's like the whole webcam fits inside.
Yes. So what we've seen, that's a good comment. So we've tested the like up to 8 to 12 widgets per page. And it still works at that level. If you want to go over that, I totally recommend that you use the REST API and go get your data on your own and set the context. Maybe something a bit more minimalist also. You do get touch optimized interface if you use the widget or the button, so that let's say the scroll works correctly on Android and iPhone inside the widget. But of course, yeah, it's a good comment. Questions on Widgets API, Twitter in general?
So what made you guys decide to be a training versus what determined that decision?
Yeah, that one is I wasn't the design lead for that one, but this sandboxing, the fact that we could sandbox and make sure that we could guarantee that what we were shipping was working. That's something that the cost of supporting a widget that doesn't work so well for millions of users is really, really high. So it's a trade-off that we decided to make, that we could guarantee that within the boundary of our iframe and within whatever is included in our iframe, we have full control of that stack. And then there's this frontier that's created by the iframe that enables us to guarantee that. Since Twitter was invented to complain if Twitter ships stuff that doesn't work, people complain a lot about it. Another question here?
Mention something about API.
It's clutch.io, clutch.io. It's been released a week ago, I think, in open source. So if you checked on the Twitter blog, you'll find it most likely. We have a pretty big open source. Bureau at Twitter. So there's a few guys working full time on open source stuff, and we're constantly evaluating everything that we ship that we can open source, or when we do an acquisition, if the product is going to be discontinued or used internally at Twitter and we can open source it. So we go through this sanity process. We make sure that we license everything under Apache 2, which is, I think, the cleanest license, and then for code at least, and then we release it. So as I mentioned, twitter.github.com has a lot of our stuff. If you're interested in these things, of course we're hiring. If you want to work on open source web layer, or if hearing about Hogan and Mustache gets you all excited, that's things we do. No jokes here. I can maybe take one or two questions still, if there's anything about the API. If not, you can reach me. I'm at Frog in the Valley on Twitter. My Twitter handle at twitter.com, so froginthevalley@twitter.com. Will reach me by email. Any question? Yeah, sure.
So I sort of on the iframe location as well, but I was wondering, like, in terms of scalability, is it better to do that client side with just like pure JavaScript, or I mean, do you guys have like a massive sort of farm?
If you have the server side, so you optimize for the resources you have or you don't.
Right.
So if you have a lot of server resources, it's optimal for users to render it. But if not, well, you can defer on all their computing power sitting on their disk. All right, thanks everyone.